So the stress of going last kind of has my nerves through the roof, so bear with me. So as an Egyptian and Syrian American, the revolutions in both these countries has really moved me in the last couple of years, and that's why I was really looking forward to working in the Middle East and North Africa division of Human Rights Watch this past summer. So at Human Rights Watch, I spent some time investigating access to accountability for torture victims within Egypt, and I was really taken aback by how often I was staring at the bruised face and broken body of a child, and how through our research, and because we had a larger issue that we were looking at, this fact that there were child torture victims got swept away into the rest of the research. So I wanted to take the time today, instead of talking more about my own work, to kind of give you guys a primer about the issue and steps for a solution. So, before coming to law school, I worked for a time as a journalist. And one of the most important lessons I learned is that how you frame an issue can have a profound impact on how people understand, synthesize, and support the information that you give them. Let's take the story of Ahmed al-Musalmani, a boy whose story I came across while working at Human Rights Watch. Ahmed was 14 years old when he was arrested at a checkpoint in Syria by Bashar al-Assad's men after they found an anti-government song on his cell phone. Because he was alone at the time of his arrest, his family had no idea what had happened to him for 3 years. They and the rest of the world finally learned the truth when a defector smuggled out of Syria thousands of photos from inside the country's prisons. Ahmed's uncle found amongst these photos a picture of his nephew's mutilated body. These images, too graphic to show here, revealed that Ahmed, along with thousands of other detainees, including other children, had been starved, beaten, and tortured. Imagine I took Ahmed's story and wrote a headline that said, "Rebel supporter detained for threatening regime with anti-Assad propaganda." Now imagine instead that I took his same story, but rather wrote the headline as 14-year-old boy tortured in prison for anti-Assad song on phone. The way you would think about Ahmed and his treatment would be profoundly different depending on which headline you read. In the first instance, you may think of Ahmed as a radical political prisoner who's being imprisoned and potentially tortured, arguably for national security reasons. But if you read the second headline, Ahmed would just be the innocent boy he was, the boy who was arbitrarily detained and tortured for something so trivial. Why is it then that in the United States we overwhelmingly frame our discussion of torture as the first headline, through its use on political prisoners and suspected terrorists? A poll conducted earlier this year by Reuters showed that 2 out of 3 American adults supported the use of torture on suspected terrorists, a level of support similar to countries like Nigeria where militant attacks are common. But if told that their support may condone its use on children, how many people do you think would then support the use of torture? We need to talk about child torture victims too, or else we risk accepting a practice that is both absolutely prohibited under law, subject to no exceptions, and a practice that is detrimental to thousands of children globally. Within the last year alone, international human rights organizations have called attention to the abuse of children in numerous countries, including Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Australia, and both Israel and Egypt, 2 countries that receive the largest amount of US foreign aid worth billions. Even during US missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, our forces apprehended and detained thousands of boys suspected in participating in armed activities. After 9/11, at least 15 children like Omar Khadir, were taken to Guantanamo Bay, many of whom alleged torture, including threats of rape, sleep deprivation, and shackling in painful positions. At least 2 child detainees attempted suicide while at Guantanamo Bay, and 1 detainee, imprisoned since the time he was a child, took his life at the age of 21. According to the United Nations, a worrying trend shows an increase by the thousands of child torture victims each year, and an unknown number die in custody. We must actively work to reverse this trend and abolish the use of torture on children globally. Under international law, the prohibition against the use of torture has developed into a fundamental legal principle which no country may violate under any condition, including both war and national security. This prohibition against torture has been reiterated in a number of international instruments, including the Geneva Conventions and the Convention Against Torture. The Convention on the Rights of a Child also provides further protections against such abuse. As a state party to this convention, a country assumes the legal obligation to ensure that no child is subjected to any kind of torture or other cruel and inhuman treatment. This convention is one of the most widely ratified international instruments and binds every country in the world to its obligations with the sole exception of the United States. Following South Sudan and Somalia's ratification last year, the United States became the only country in the world to have not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. While the widespread ratification of these international instruments is undoubtedly an important component on the fight against torture use on children, putting an end to the use of torture and other abusive treatment demands abolition both in law and in practice. The first step is global acknowledgement that children, and not just political prisoners, prisoners of war, and suspected terrorists, are victims of torture. In the United States, this discussion must also include confronting our own allegations of child abuse in Guantanamo Bay and other detention sites. The next and arguably more difficult step is to dismantle systematic and institutional authorization of the use of torture on children. This means rejecting the admissibility of national security and the theater of war as validation for their arbitrary arrest, detention, and interrogation. Lastly, we must never condone justifications for its use again. Torture simply is not, under any condition, a practice open to exceptions. International legal obligations aside, we also have a moral duty to end the torture and abusive treatment of children to protect their physical and psychological innocence. The deep, long-term effects of torture are widely known. Even short periods of torture and other abusive or traumatic treatment can lead to lifelong depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. In conflict areas where the ill treatment of children is often endemic, the aftermath of torture and abusive treatment can impact an entire generation, as is arguably the case in Syria today. With 37 recognized armed conflicts occurring globally and seismic shifts in the political landscapes of many countries, including our own, now is the time to frame our discussion around and take affirmative steps to defend the most vulnerable victims of torture who are facing abuse in the name of peace, power, and national security. We are unquestionably responsible for protecting the children who will one day be responsible for protecting this world. Thank you.